Just to introduce our speakers very briefly. First up, we will have Katina Conomos, I hope I'm saying that right, who will be talking about mussels, mussel loss, and how important they are in the Hauraki Gulf. We will then hear from Kelsey Miller, who's going to be talking about kina barrens, and what kina removal on a large scale looks like. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the wonderful Sue Nurota, who's going to talk about connections between the land and the sea, kūtai, and connections for people to the spaces that we hold so dear, to our wahitaonga, to our spaces that we hold so precious. So we will have our first speaker, who is going to be Katina Conomos, Program Director at Revive Our Gulf. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Revive Our Gulf is a collaboration between the Nature Conservation New Zealand, University of Auckland, and the Mussel Reef Restoration Trust. They are working collaboratively to restore the mussel reefs in Te Kapamoana, Te Moana Nui Atoi, the Hauraki Gulf. So please, if you can come up, Katina, give her a round of applause.
Thank you. E nā mana, e nā waka, e nā reo, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi to you, Koha, for your introduction, and absolutely, you have really cool mum, and on her shoulders we stand today with this mahi, so thank you for your acknowledgement of your mum. And to our generous hosts, Sarah and Ewan, for providing this space and this opportunity to come together. And I have to say it's a little bit of a bit of mental tension, really, to come together and celebrate the oceans when that body of water out there, as we know through report after report, and I don't know about you, but the fatigue of reading about how in trouble this space is. It's hard, it's a heavy load. So it is important against that backdrop to come together and to celebrate and to acknowledge the effort and be energised by one another and by the various activities. Because it does take all of us to make a difference and to reflect on how our individual actions do put pressure on that really precious space out there, the ocean. So thank you for coming along tonight and for your interest. I'm, as Koha said, my name's Katina. I'm the Program Director for Revive Our Gulf. I have had the privilege of working on this kaupapa for about 6 months, so also acknowledging my colleague Peter Miles up the back there, who's been with us for a little bit longer than I have. But I have had an interest in the Gulf a deep interest in the Gulf for about 5 or 6 years, working on various kaupapa in Te Kapamoana. I live in Thames, and if you detect a little Australian twang, it is because I am Australian. I have a foot in both countries. I'm a citizen of both New Zealand and Australia, and I've lived here for 13 years. So yeah, very honoured to be working on this mahi. So Revive Our Gulf, our mission is to re-mussel the Gulf. So I think that's a pretty cool mission, pretty ambitious mission, but a pretty vital one as well. So I'm going to start by talking about why do we need to re-mussel the Gulf. I'll step through this pretty quickly because I suspect many of you in this room will know part of this story. So what this map shows, those darker shaded areas, were where there were once historic mussel beds in the Hauraki Gulf, and there was an abundance of mussels on the seafloor. And as you can see, they're 600 square kilometres. That's equivalent to what we think of 80,000 fields. So these spaces to get our head around, it's enormous what the mussels used to be in the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park. And of course, they were seen as a resource and kai, which is cool, but our methods to extract them were as you can see, quite destructive. And so there was quite a lot of dredging activity occurred in the Gulf. And you can see what is fascinating about this image, the size of those mussels. If you have a close look, they're enormous. And some of the narratives and storytelling goes that they were sold sort of just around Auckland. They were sort of sold put in oil. So just imagine a sort of, I can't personally imagine what that industry must have felt like. But the mussels were dredged in the Gulf, not just in the Gulf, throughout New Zealand as well. And what this graph shows, you can see this is the the tonnage of mussels, and the fishery, the kūtai fishery collapsed, you can see, towards the end of the 1960s and 70s. So quite a sharp graph. And it's unfortunate that we still see graphs like that today in some of our other tonga in the Hauraki Gulf. So that was, nearly 50 years ago, and the mussels haven't come back on their own naturally. We don't see mussel beds forming and staying there naturally. And if you think about the process of extraction, it's not just the mussels that were taken, but the damage done to the seafloor, and we're still dealing with that today. So it's important to think about why mussels are important, and I'm going to throw to the floor here and see if my learned friends here in this room can tell me why mussels are important to the ecosystem. Sorry, the filter feeders, yes, so they clean the water. Yeah, John, that's what you're going to say? Yeah, there's quite a long list, yeah.
The fish eat them. The
fish eat them, that's right. They are food for other species, absolutely. Yeah, I saw a cool photo the other day of a snapper with a whole mussel in its mouth. It was pretty cool, yeah. Patrick?
Habitat engineer.
Correct, yeah. They create habitat for others. Sue? You were going to say habitat? It's like a game of Snap. Yeah.
It's a room full of nerds.
It's a room full of nerds, I know, yeah. Anyone else? Other things that mussels do? Okay.
They provide food for communities as well?
Correct, yeah. Correct, yeah. Peter?
Harmful forms of nitrogen.
That they do, yes. They absorb harmful forms of nitrogen.
They taste good.
They taste good, yeah, they taste good. They absorb carbon. What haven't we covered there? When they form in their structures, they can help reduce wave energy. They stabilize the sea floor. So these they're little creatures, but they're really mighty. And I know in the marine environment, it's in some ways it can be difficult just to focus on one species. But when we look at this one little species, the contribution they make is enormous. So you'd like to think about what we've lost in the Hauraki Gulf is pretty significant. So that's why we have this wonderful ambition to re-mussel the Gulf. So about Revive Our Gulf, what do we do? And as our project was introduced, it's a collaboration. So I work for the Mussel Reef Restoration Trust. We work with the Nature Conservancy, the University of Auckland. We have 3 iwi partners, and there's funders and collaborators, supporters, volunteers. It's a rich, rich family. But I tried to sort of break it down into the things we do. On one side, there's the restoration know-how. So we don't yet know how to successfully restore mussel beds. We're having a go at it, and we are having some successes, but we have a lot to learn. So there's a lot of research to do in the marine space. And this project has been running for about 10 years back. It was about 10 years ago that your mum was having those conversations, Koha. So there is a lot for us to learn, and we are learning, and we're still learning. So there's the restoration know-how. What is success? Where do we restore? How do we restore? When do we restore? And then on the other side of the coin, working in the marine space is quite, in a marine restoration space, is still quite an emerging area. So we have to look at the political and social will. Our regulatory environment doesn't easily permit these activities. So there's the political and social will, building the capability and capacity amongst whether it's our institutions and communities, our iwi partners, to undertake restoration, creating the environment of enabling conditions in our regulatory systems, and of course securing long-term funding for this work to occur. So that's what keeps us busy. But now to the pictures. So in terms of what we do, we work with our iwi partners. We have 3 iwi partners we're currently working with. Koha mentioned Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, who is the longest relationship the project has had. The photos here are of our work with Ngāi Taki Tamaki. So we've spent time in Wānanga, understanding what that iwi's aspirations are for their rohi moana, and we're looking to design restoration work in their rohi moana this coming year. So the photo on the right is our lead scientist, Jen Hillman, looking, and that machine she's holding is an ROV, it's an underwater drone. So we work in partnership with our iwi partners to design the restoration projects in their area. Some of you will have seen footage like this. This is down at Ōkahu Bay. Yep. So this photo is from Ōkahu Bay. So our method at the moment is to translocate mussels from mussel farms, so the commercial mussels, place them back in the moana. So some of you will have seen images like this. We put the mussels into the moana and create mussel beds. And this photo is one of my favourites. It's a photo taken 24 hours after the bed was created in Ōkahu Bay. So we create those mussel beds, but the work doesn't end there. So then the period of study, I guess, commences. And the University of Auckland, as the science lead on this program, then takes the lead on monitoring those mussels. So the mussels in Akahu Bay have been down for just over a year, or actually, sorry, losing track of time, about a year and a half now. And so they're continually, regularly monitored. We have reporting obligations back to council, but part of the work we're doing now is looking at what are the things we need to monitor to understand what a successful, healthy mussel bed looks like. So quite a bit of underwater time for some of our science team. And as we've gone on in this project, we've understood that the thing that we need to really understand is how will mussels breed successfully in place? Because until they breed in place, we're not going to be able to scale this up across the whole Hauraki Gulf or across, in larger scale areas. So what we're doing now is learning and understanding. And this image looks at, you've got the kūtai on the left. They're broadcast spawners, so you can see that they spawn, and there's these tiny little larvae. They're microscopic, and they float around in the water column, and then they'll attach to something. Some of you will know that oysters will attach once to a rock. Mussels, we understand, attach multiple times. We thought until recently that was twice, but we're starting to believe it could be more than that. So we're looking at what do mussels prefer to attach to in that first settlement, to try and understand how we might be able to support what's called natural recruitment. To that end, we've partnered with Kelly Tarleton's this year, Kelly Tarleton's Marine Wildlife Trust, and they are doing some research on seaweeds, and specifically looking at the seaweeds within the Hauraki Gulf, some of those seaweeds from around the Noises, which is where Sue is. You'll hear a little bit more on that later. But looking at the photo on the left there is Mallory C from Kelly Tarleton's, and you can't see them, but in that container were 40,000 larvae. They're microscopic, you can't see them with your naked eye, and putting them into a specially designed tank at Kelly Tarleton's, which had seaweeds in it, and looking at which then the larvae preferred to attach to. So there's lots of sort of research going on behind the scenes of how do we understand these challenges, because we're in this discovery phase. We need to crack some of these codes so that we can then do this work on a larger scale. So that's a bit of an introduction to our program. I could talk all night, but I'm mindful that we have a number of colleagues to follow with really fascinating mahi. Because it's our World Ocean Day and this day is about action, I've also included a list of what can you do? How do you apply your mussel to the Hauraki Gulf and to the restoration kaupapa of restoring the mussels? These 5, I'll just step through them. One is get politically active. It's important to raise awareness of the oceans amongst our politicians. So if we poll people in a room like this, we're all going to say oceans are important. But if we then go and do that across New Zealand, there's the cost of living, the housing crisis, and I'm not saying that they're not important issues, but oceans needs to be recognised higher. So talk to local MPs and politicians about the importance of the oceans and the Hauraki Gulf. Write letters. It does matter in terms of putting the oceans on the radar. So that's something I personally do a lot of. I could talk more about that. Happy to talk more if you'd like some more advice there. Be a mindful consumer, and I think this covers, these are things we can do. So whether it's asking where your fish was caught and how it was caught when you go to a restaurant, choosing less plastic, dealing with your rubbish well, those things, being a good consumer and a mindful consumer do make a difference. If you fish, be a good fisher. Limit your catch, not take your, limit your catch, not catch your limit. There's some good advice on a good fishing website around some good practices. Get involved, and I've put that there because there's programs like beach cleanups and mangrove cleanups, and those sorts of programs are really important to put your weight behind, and they do make a difference to Te Kapa Moana. And finally, if you are able and willing, these projects do all require funding. To fund Revive Our Gulf, we have a program called, we're in collaboration with the Auckland Foundation. There's a program called Gulf Guardians, and that fund supports both the shellfish restoration work in the Hauraki Gulf and also riparian planting and waterway planting. So there are ways each of us can take action today. Quick acknowledgement of our ecosystem of sponsors, partners and supporters. As you can see, it really does take a village to do this work. And thank you for your attention and interest in coming along tonight.
So next up we have the wonderful Kelsey Miller. I was fortunate enough to meet Kelsey over on Otata for the first time when she helped to facilitate the Kina Baron Wānanga that we ran in 2020, I want to say, with a group of rangatahi where we took them over to Otata to experience the wonderful space that is the Noisies, and then we got them to open up some kina, have a look at the different differences between those that were in Kina Barrens and Kina kelp forests. Kelsey is a PhD student. She's in the home stretch of her PhD. She's researching the potential and the feasibility of kina removal on a large scale to see what happens with kelp restoration. So please welcome Kelsey Miller.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kelsey Miller. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the wonderful celebration. I think all presentations should start out with a swim. So a little bit about myself. I'm obviously not from here. I'm from Canada originally, worked on the west coast of the US, and urchin barrens are a big issue there as well. A huge stretch of the coast lost over 95% of their kelp forests. And so I came here to study this and see what some of the options would be to restore these kelp forests. So why should we care about kelp? Kelp is incredible. It provides productivity. It's one of the most productive environments on the globe. It provides this complex three-dimensional habitat, and this supports really high biodiversity, and that supports many of our fisheries, tourism, and they're also culturally important. Trying to value these habitats is mind-blowing. It's about $500 billion a year globally. But I'd like to think about it that these are all, to paraphrase one of our colleagues at the lab, these are all useful justifications to when somebody asks you, why do we study kelp? As if a love of kelp is not sufficient. And as I mentioned, this is a global issue. These habitats are declining faster than coral reefs and tropical forests. So here in New Zealand, we have two species that really structure our rocky reefs. So kina, or a sea urchin, they are amazing. They're endemic to New Zealand, so that means they're from here and nowhere else. They are a traditional food source for Maori, and they have become a big commercial fishery as well. So they are managed under the QMS, and they're one of the world's biggest sea urchins. The main species of kelp that we have in northeastern New Zealand is Aclonia radiata. And compared to many other species of kelp, they have a really broad thermal range, which is great for us in that in many parts of the world, they're battling both overgrazing by sea urchins and climate change, whereas here, the kelps are not quite as much of at risk just from temperature. So kina barrens we're starting to recognize how big of an issue they are, both in northeastern New Zealand and the rest of the country. So outside of most of the protected areas, they are the dominant habitat on our reefs within this narrow depth range. So what you can see up at the top is where there's, next to the shore in the shallow waters, we normally have this fringe of algae that's normally fucoids and small algae, and then this band of just straight kina barren and bare rock. And then lucky for us, we have a kelp forest down below. So that's very useful from a restoration perspective. And what we have learned through looking at old records and old oral histories is that these reefs didn't used to look like this. That used to be algae the whole way through. And a lot of what we've learned about this is from marine reserves, is when the marine reserves are implemented, the predators of kina, mostly the kura, the tamari, the crayfish, and the snapper, can drop those numbers down of kina and then restore the kelp. So kina barrens are not always easy to define. In general, it's just an area that is devoid of macroalgae and kelp and high numbers of kina. And this was first noted over 50 years ago, and even then it was linked to this process where we were overfishing. So my work is looking at how we can restore kelp to these barrens. And with any successful restoration project, we need to figure out what is the cause of kelp loss. And that's not always an easy thing. Kina overgrazing, but it can also be other stressors as well, such as I mentioned, climate change, sedimentation, or pollution. And one of the biggest issues with working in this sphere is that kelp and barrens are stable. This is the worst graph you'll see all night. But what it means is that if you look along the bottom, you can have relatively high numbers of sea urchins, have a healthy kelp forest. But once you get past a certain point, it collapses very quickly. And then if you want to bring it back to that kelp state, it's not so easy. And so you have to reduce the densities to a very low number before you can have any benefit. So it's not a linear thing where you take out a few kina and you get a little bit of kelp. It's all or nothing. And so those numbers are roughly 10 times the difference. So it's generally about 1 kina per square meter can maintain barrens. So there's a lot of different ways that we can reduce the densities of kina. One of the easiest ways is to let nature do its own thing. So let the predators come back, and they can do that through marine protection, or we can do it manually and do active restoration. So if we're going to do that, we need to think about how to do it and figure out, are these methods actually addressing the cause of kelp loss? Do they work? Are they effective ecologically? Are they practical? Are they ethical? Are they culturally sensitive? And are we doing them in the right spots and at the right scales? So here's Koha demonstrating very nicely. One of the challenges with kina in barrens is that they are unhealthy. Because they don't have food, the roe quality is not so good, so harvest is typically not an option. So around the world, there's been just under 80 projects that have done sea urchin removal. And when I looked at them, almost all of them found that if you do remove sea urchins, kelp comes back. It's good to know, and it's also very rapid. So about 1.5 years, which is a lot faster than the 10 to 20 years through marine protection. So the methods that we can use: restoration, harvest, and that's dependent on whether or not the kina are good enough quality, and it's also managed under QMS, so numbers don't always add up. And around the world, the most commonly used technique is culling the sea urchins, which is, I would say, a good last resort if we don't have another option. Because if those densities don't come down, there won't be kelp, but it's just how do you want to get there? So Nick Shears, before I started, was rather concerned about a lot of different community groups and people who are really interested in doing large-scale kina removal. And so he wanted to get in front of it and say, look, we need to find out the science behind this to figure out how it can work and if it does work. And because this project involves a large-scale removal of a tonga species, there's been a lot of partnership with Mana Whenua and discussions about, is it okay to cull them in this experimental environment? So that's what we did. We tried to figure out, where and when kina removal can be effective in the Hauraki Gulf. So we selected, with community groups, partners, and Mana Whenua, 4 large areas, and tried to use these big areas and natural constriction points to reduce the amount of kina coming back in to eat the new kelp, and did a single removal effort. That took around 450 hours for 7 hectares. It's a lot of work and it's very slow. And we put in more than that in monitoring of these sites to figure out how this actually works. So we're trying to determine if it works for kelp recovery, whether it benefits the kina that remain in the site and come back in, and also if it has any benefits for the rest of the ecosystem. So these, I lied, there are more charts, but they're not as bad as the first one. So in the orange is the control sites, and in the green is the removal sites. And the dotted line, it's a bit hard to see, is when we removed them. You can see that beforehand, there were lots of kina in both the control and removal sites. We went through, removed about 90% of them. And after the first year, there weren't many. And between the first year and the second year, we're starting to see more kina coming back into the area. That being said, most of them at this point are still cryptic, so they're not out on the reef actively grazing. But this goes to show that this is only a temporary fix. This is my favorite graph and makes me feel okay about the project. What this shows is that kelp cover and all of these sites went from 5% to 20% after 1 year and about 45% after 2 years. And when we started, we thought that kelp would come back slowly, close to the deeper kelp forest and work its way through. But we saw kelp across the entire sites and recolonizing the areas naturally, multiple species, so without any seeding or transplanting. So underwater, got it. This is what we saw. So it went from kina barren to small recruits. This was after 8 months. Adult kelp plants to an almost forest. So this is Hoturu Otoi. The water visibility is much better out there, so a lot of my pictures are from there. And from above the water, using drone imagery, the yellow line is the boundaries. You can see there was a little bit of kelp both in it and down below in the south. After 8 months, you could see a large amount in it, and then after 18 months is almost all dark, whereas the little patch of kelp down below almost disappeared. So it's really easy for me to stand up here and tell you about how well this works. I estimate maybe 2.5 million kelp grew back, but that's only part of the story. So the rest of the ecosystem is also important. And the kina, the ones that are left, they lucked out, they get more food, and this is apparent in their row and condition. Fishes and crayfish are not so lucky. So all of these sites are still open to fishing. They're all very heavily fished. The site out at Hoturu Otoi, there's almost always commercial cray pots in it. The sites near Leigh, almost always spear fishermen in there. And at Otata, there's all sorts of fishing nonstop. So the reason why there's few fish and crayfish isn't because there's a lack of habitat, it's because of overfishing. So creating more habitat isn't going to fix that. So this is not a full recovery, it's one step. So what have we learned? I think it's really important to keep in mind, kina are good. There's so much negative publicity around them, and they are awesome. That being said, if kina barrens are present, that will prevent kelp from coming back. The other big takeaway from this project is that it shows that kelp recovery is completely feasible in the Hauraki Gulf. At the inner Gulf site at Otata, we weren't sure if that was, if there was too much sedimentation for it to come back. But this shows that it's very effective. Kina removal in any form requires it to be large, discrete areas to minimize kina coming back in, and you have to get it below that threshold before it can work. And we're lucky in this part of the world that we have adjacent kelp forests down below or nearby that can reseed these reefs. And so it is, I think, very optimistic, but we really do need to pay attention to what it can't do. So it doesn't address the root cause of kinnabarrens, of the overfishing. It doesn't create this full ecosystem recovery, and it's going to be temporary unless kina are continually removed. So it brings back the trees, but not the birds of the underwater forests. To have a full restoration, we need to restore these natural processes, these trophic cascades, and build resilience. But if kina removal is to be used, it needs to be incorporated into a much more holistic conservation and management plan. It can be used to jumpstart restoration, to bring kelp back, in a year and a half versus 10 years. And there's lots of different options for removal. Predators, it's a very simple one. They can do the work for you. Harvest, I think most of us would agree that that's a better option than going out and culling them. And culling can be a last resort. The other thing that our study has really highlighted is we need a lot of collaboration among everybody in the room to make this effective. My role has been to provide the science. I'm not going to make the regulation changes, but I hope that this can be useful for people who are. Yes, and I wanted to thank our partners in this. Ngāti Manahiri and Ngāi Taiki Tamaki have taught me a lot, and it's been an incredible experience. A lot of time in the water, and I couldn't have done it without these people. And I know we're doing questions later, but I'll leave you with that slide.
Cool. I'd like to now introduce our final and third speaker, the wonderful Sue Nyorida. Sue is one of the custodians of the Noisies, also known as Otata. As I said before, she was very kind to let us host our first haerenga out to Otata. The first Kinabaran wānanga was out there. Otata is a group of islands in the Hauraki Gulf. In the inner Hauraki Gulf, the focus of many years of conservation work. The Noisies Trust was established in 1995 to help ensure the long-term protection of the island. Please give it up for the wonderful Sue Nyorida.
No pressure. Tēnā koutou katoa. I feel so privileged to be here today, and it feels like whānau around me because Katina, Kelsey, Sarah and Koha have all supported work done at the Noisies over the years, and they're part of a great big team of people who have got us to where we are today. Without them, we couldn't have learned what we have. Just quickly to explain where the Noisies are located, if you looked out here, you'd actually see them. They're about 24 kilometres from Auckland, and obviously Waiheke there over on the right-hand side, and Tiritiri Mātangi, the top of the screen there. So they're very accessible to Auckland. In fact, Auckland's kind of swallowing them up these days. This is a bit of an overview of the islands themselves. So obviously you can see the islands and the rock stacks and the little islands, but underneath there's so much more. There's these huge interconnected reef systems and everything. And what we've realised from spending so much time out there is that the amount of land you can see is tiny compared to the ocean that surrounds it. So to consider the land and the sea separately is just completely wrong. The health of the land is, to a greater or lesser degree, incredibly reliant on the health of our oceans. And in the future, we need to look at protection with a different lens on it. Anyway, here, just a few reasons to love the noises. They've been predator-free now. They were the first islands in New Zealand to become predator-free in the early 60s, or one of them, Ruapuki Island. And they were made predator-free in the early 80s. Rats reinvaded, and about 5 times. But in 2002, they became permanently predator-free, and we're seeing the results of that. The seabirds are, it's a mixed bag. I'll tell you more about that. Anyway, we'll carry on and just have a look. This is just a little idea about what predator-free means. So it just means that the vegetation can flourish because there aren't rats and things eating the seed bank. And when that happens, you can get all kinds of bird life, and the terrestrial birds have improved massively. I'll be out there tomorrow, and this is a little idea of what you'll hear there at this time of the year, is this bird song. And that's largely because the predators are gone, but also because of the seabirds. So the seabirds, if they're on the islands and they're burrowing, they're bringing all those marine nutrients onto the island, which that fires up all the forest. And it means that your insect populations and your reptile populations can explode. So that's a wetapanga, and that's my hand. And that's on the wharipaku. So you go, they like congregating there. But you know, these things are really possible because of the predator-free nature of the islands and the seabirds. But we are missing a huge part of the equation in firing this up if we don't protect our marine environments, because you can make an island predator-free and you can plant it and revegetate it and put all the love in the world into it. And I know that there are people here who do that. But unless we look after our marine ecosystems, that whole side of things, which is going to contribute to the health of the land, is missing. The birds can't breed and they can't thrive if they can't eat. Also, of course, those marine nutrients which then get deposited on the island by way of guano and eggs, dead chicks, etc., that then runs off into the nearshore marine environment, and that fires up all of that as well. So here we go with the seabirds. So this is what I mean about when they come into burrow, you get this free composting service because they go underground. And you know, they're bringing all this food in and out, and this is what you will be hearing out here tomorrow night. So it's pretty special. These are amazing, you know, and it would be, whether their numbers are increasing or not, it's too early to say. They're very long-lived. They don't start breeding till they're quite old, so you need some years of data before we can determine whether in fact their populations are increasing or decreasing. But there are many other birds like the korora and the white-fronted terns. Their numbers are definitely decreasing, and probably the reason for that is they forage much closer to hand. So again, if your waters aren't healthy, your seabirds can't thrive and they can't breed. Yeah. So we've had a long research association with starting, probably back in the 60s, but this was with the first rat study and eradication. This was in the 1970s, actually. Health and safety wasn't quite as robust in those days. But you know, this is when we started to learn, and we've continued to learn with all the different people who've come onto the islands. This is Auckland Museum's team of researchers. So they've started a long-term study of land and sea to try and document change, and the hope is that we will get marine protection and we'll be able to compare what the land and sea look like today to what it will look like as things start to regenerate and come back. And I think we're going to learn a lot, not only about what happens in the sea, but how the oceans have a positive impact on the land. This is the other thing that is going to teach us an awful lot, is we know that there were people who were here long before us on the islands. And this is how we know, because these middens tell the story of Maori occupation for a really long time, in fact, pre-rangitoto. So there's numbers of layers in there. And when we look into those layers, it's like looking into a library. So you can see the changes over time. What started hundreds of years ago, the sizes of some of the shellfish and the fish bones and everything, they're just sticking out of the cliff there. And so there've been a couple of excavations, and that's all been analysed, and there's been more than 20 species of fish identified in there. And today, for some reason, we have this fear that by putting marine protection around something, we're going to lose our ability to catch a few skanky snapper. Really? You know, without acknowledging what we've lost. You know, we've just lost an enormous amount, mostly things that we don't even know were there. And this can help to guide us with what we would aspire to when we do look at recovery. So this is the marine environment round the Noises, round Otata. It is really diverse, and it's probably because of where the islands are located in the Gulf. That first slide I showed you with the islands, you know, they're on the cusp of that clear outer Gulf waters and the more turbid inner Gulf waters. So there's a huge amount of currents that circulate around the islands. And with all the different reefs and rock stacks, you know, and the different aspects of them, you get different things happening all around the islands, from, you know, rhodoliths and mussels and oysters and scallops and what once was amazing rocky reefs and kūtai, reef fish, you know, and pelagics. And I thought Kelsey would like this one. This is actually an intertidal snapshot of the area that Kelsey and Nick did their kina work on off Otata. And you know, it's so beautiful. It's like a garden on the land, and it didn't look like that. So it was just such joy when I went there on a spring tide actually I think that was about September last year. And I just thought, oh, wow. And it's hard to describe what it's like. I've realised it's really hard to describe loss, because by the very nature of the word, you can't see loss. So you don't, unless you know what it looked like beforehand, you can't, nor can you understand that didn't look like that. Yeah, this is what we would love to see happen around the Noises, is to encompass all those rock stacks and all those that huge network of underwater reefs and islands. You need something about 60 square kilometres, which is what this is, because that completely encloses all that biodiversity and all that precious different ground out there. So it helps the maximum amount of things to regenerate and spill over into other areas. It also allows the kūtai enough room to walk from the reefs out into the sand, as we now know they do, because we've found that out from marine reserves, without getting caught. Because I think this next slide will tell you, it's a pretty good picture of what I mean, and that's only the bigger boats. And that's just looking in one direction on the weekend. So yeah, without protection, things don't have a lot of chance. The other thing that's very special around the Noises are the kūtai, and you know, this is something that Katina has worked with us on, many people have. This was only in 2020, and this reef was already being depleted by then, but Koha would have seen it before then. And he would attest to the fact that there were a lot more mussels on that reef before then. And this is just a trip, an advocacy trip, which we do a lot of, trying to get people to understand why it's important to protect. And it's a great thing to do, because you can sit behind a desk in Wellington and write your documents, but unless you've got unless you've got the place that you're writing about in mind and you've made a connection to it, you're not going to care. It's just going to be another piece of paper. This is what it looks like now, and it's even worse. And that's just in 3 short years. And that's partly because the scallop bed that was out there has been decimated. The kūtai have gone, the reef fish have gone. So people come out there in their flash boats. Sorry, that sounds judgy, that sounds kind of judgy, but you know, there's this kind of got to get something mentality. And so what happens is you see them dive, or they'll come ashore and they'll think, oh, well, we'll get some mussels instead. And you know, when everyone thinks that, you see these things depleting. And you end up with the kina barrens like this around the islands as a result of people thinking, oh, we'll get the big snapper and we'll get the kūtai. This is what Kelsey's area used to look like. It's just typical of probably 60% of the underwater marine world around the Noises nowadays. And it should look like this, but not just with the Eclonia, but with all those other seaweeds and all the other algae. It's this beautiful, beautiful mosaic down there. And you know, people go to look for the big things, but actually the little things are pretty special. And it's those little things that are building blocks for the things that we hold precious as kai moana. But you know, if you want to protect your snapper and your crayfish, you have also to protect all of the things within that chain that they need to survive. And we also need to be able to bring people together to connect them to the place so that we can understand what it takes to protect, and that we can all have the confidence to sit at the table together. And for mana whenua, if they're asked how should we protect this, that they have the same degree of knowledge of place as it is today that we all do, so that we all clearly understand the issues that are being faced. This is a regenerating mussel bed at the Noises. It's just a little short video I took last summer. And by this coming summer, unless we have protection, the chances are it will be wiped out and we'll have to start again with another lot of regeneration. But each time those kūtai numbers drop, so there's less biomass to kickstart this regeneration. If we lose these things, we lose the ability to know how to kickstart recovery elsewhere, and we lose the ability to try things. We lose the ability to potentially use what might be protected within the Noises to try things elsewhere. So I'm sure I've forgotten half of what I meant to say, but I've probably gone on long enough. So if you'd like more information, please go to our website. We are not very active on social media at the moment. I can see Katina smiling. But it is winter. We will be out there tomorrow, and again, this trip coming up is about bringing people together to see how we might work collaboratively, because that's what I want. May I have one more minute? Yeah. Okay. So, you know, the thing that I'm learning, and I think we all are, is that to have Kelsey's science is fantastic, and to have our family's input to say that area hasn't looked like that for 40 years and it does now, but there's this happening here and this happening there. That's fantastic. But to really understand how regeneration works, we need to be paying attention to the moon, to the phases of the moon, the maramataka, the tides, the weather conditions that we've had over the last few years that have all had an influence on how well something works and doesn't. And I know I don't understand enough of it yet, but I understand enough with prompts from mana whenua and iwi who've been out there to realise now that a rock isn't just a rock, they're not all created equal because it depends on where that current is on that rock. So the current's the thing they're going to bring the recruits back on or not onto the rocks, or make your seaweed come this way. So it'd be interesting to see, after 3 years of La Nina conditions, if we get a reversal and we get El Nino, we'll see a really different set of circumstances that hits the Hauraki Gulf. And what will happen when that happens? But I don't think we've studied those things enough yet to necessarily know, but maybe if we bring all of our knowledge sets together, and when we design projects, we actually are looking at the season that something is happening, the lunar phase that something's happening, and the weather conditions that we've had over this period of time, we might be able to begin to really understand how to restore. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The floor is now yours for anybody who would like to ask some questions. We've already had this lovely gentleman over here ask his first question. So what is the progress towards our wonderful marine reserve on the Noises?
So the marine protection proposal at the Noises, and I worked with Sue on this, which is why I'm taking the microphone, is part of a wider package for marine protection in the Hauraki Gulf. So there are 11 new high protected area sites proposed in the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park. That requires special legislation. So the legislation we have at the moment isn't suitable to enact that. So it requires new legislation. We're getting a little bit tired of hearing the whispers that it's almost there, but we are applying as much sort of pressure and advocacy as we can to see that come out from this government before the end of the parliamentary term. So the signs are positive that we will see that draft legislation, but if you're familiar with legislation, you'll know that it's generally a long process from there. So once we see a draft bill, it still has to go through a public process, through select committee and so on. So there will be opportunity for us all to submit in support of more marine protection in the Hauraki Gulf, and hopefully soon. So.
100%. What would be the cause for the mussel beds to be completely lost, and what could we do about it?
Well, that's I remember all my life there have been really big mussel beds around the Noises with huge mussels, and I never really thought about the little recruits and the ones that are growing. I thought, they're fine, they're not big yet. And I realised for a long time that we're talking about different things. People are talking about big mussels to me, and I'm thinking, well, I don't know what you're talking about. Those aren't big mussels, and I'm talking about mussels like this. But, most people see mussels and they think that they're the ones you get in the supermarket. So they're just ripe for the picking. So when they pop up out of the water, or they get near the surface, or there's snorkelers or divers, once people realise they're there, they're not there for long. And again, it's about understanding this. There's a season for taking those guys. And if you don't take them in the right season, then you're wasting your time. They'll be skinny and they'll be grey, and they'll most likely get thrown out. So, double whammy there.
I would say that the risk there is harvest. And with the fishing technology today, someone pops a GPS pin on it, go here, and you can see the pressure that the Noises is under. So harvest would be the answer to that.
And just as a little addition to that, there is not an appetite for surveillance and enforcement. There's not the ability to do that. Therefore, you can have a daily bag limit of 25, but when if you choose to take more, the chances of getting caught for doing that are negligible. It keeps honest people honest, and that's all.
Why don't they? That's an excellent question. Why don't they just put a rahui on it?
Why hasn't it happened? I can't believe it.
We can't lead a rahui, we can support a rahui, and I think the best way that we can support that rahui is to invite mana whenua to come to know the islands as they are today and the marine environment around them as they are today. And to do that, you've got to be able to enable people to be at the table. And if that means it's a paid job. That's fantastic, because then that knowledge is spread right throughout that particular iwi, that hapu, the whānau, and it provides confidence to be at the table to say, we know what to do in our rohi, and this is what we need to do because it's for our well-being, it's for all of our well-being, and it's actually for the health of the Hauraki Gulf and way beyond if we acknowledge these other knowledge sets and lift them up to the same level that many of us, I'd go as far as to say, are privileged in enjoying the ability to get into the Gulf when we want, how
100%.
we want.
100%.
And we need to be able to allow others who don't have that privilege to be able to be there.
What is stopping the kinas from coming back and ravaging new seaweed, please?
Kina will come back in. They are coming back in. So most kina removal projects around the world have been small, and they had to continuously remove them. Fences don't work. It's really hard to stop them. So within this project, it was trying to see that if you go big enough, will that reduce kina movement? At a lot of the sites, we just have markers on the edges of the site. Like there's not a line or a weighted lead line at the bottom, but when you swim over it, you can see it. It is a complete line, and in some places they don't come back in, other sides they do. So, the hope is just trying to do it big enough, but it's not going to be complete.
I don't know how I'm supposed to rephrase that one. Do kina have a preference to fat? Do kūtai and snapper have a preference to fat kina and skinny kina? And does a marine reserve help? That's a really bastardized way of saying your question. I'm really sorry.
Marine reserves definitely help. There was a study in California, and it was looking at whether or not crayfish have a preference for skinny kina and fat kina, and they do. I don't think anybody's studied that here or with snapper. I feel like snapper are perhaps less critical of their kina. But I think not only do marine reserves change when you have those predators actively eating them, it also changes the kina behavior, where they aren't out on the reef eating new kelp, they're just waiting for drift algae to come to them. So it's a twofold change.
Did the signing of the climate declaration have any positive impacts on the work that you guys do?
I would like to say that the leadership on these issues is so important, and those sorts of signals are vital. The goals like 30 by 30, for example, and signing up to things like that, it's vital to shift the dial. So we do need those. In terms of on the ground, in terms of the work, I can't honestly say, yes, that was a momentous, that caused something immediate in this space, but I don't think we should underestimate the importance of those leadership signals. Yeah.
May I add something to that? And again, marine protected areas, they protect the biodiversity for sure, but they also may, if we can get one there, help mitigate against things like erosion that come from climate change with the more intense storms and the sea level rise by returning the kelp forests. So, those kelp forests dampen down the impact of the swells. The kelp gets washed onto the beach and it builds up this big cushiony pile on the beach. So effectively, you've got more height to your beach and more of a sponge when the waves hit it instead of just a wallop. And then, the kelp goes on to provide food for all the invertebrates and the birds, the reptiles, and therefore the shorebirds. So, kelp is that marine biodiversity and the protection of the marine environment does far more than just protect the marine environment.
Can I just add, add something more to it? Because reflecting on your question around a climate declaration, and I think what even perhaps has shifted since the climate declarations is the talking about climate and biodiversity in the one space. You know, for even in the way that the UN is structured around those parts, you know, we've got climate and we have biodiversity. So we're now starting to see those two understood as knitted together, you know, that we can't have sort of successful climate action without a focus on biodiversity as well. So I would say that's been something, an observable shift, I think, in the last few years as sort of a practitioner in this space, which is encouraging. Yep. Kelsey, any comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, we're kind of doing our science in a bit of a bubble. And so there hasn't been any direct benefits on our work at the lab, but I would also just mention that we hadn't seen much of a change in ocean temperatures up until recently. So even up to 5 years ago, we thought we were pretty immune from ocean warming. And yes, the last couple of years we've had La Nina events, but over, I can't remember, I think it was 320 days last year we were in a marine heat wave. And those graphs are now showing that, yes, we are having massive climate-related marine effects.
Do you guys feel like you're working in isolation, or is there a national body that is helping out?
I've been to some meetings, I think it's called the Gulf Forum.
Hauraki Gulf Forum, yes.
No, how do you relate to those people?
Yeah, we work closely with the Hauraki Gulf Forum, and probably for the Hauraki Gulf, that would be the body that would pull all of our respective work together and be able to share it. And, you know, it's great. It doesn't have any legislative teeth. Is that the right word?
Not sort of in an enforcement manner.
An enforcement manner, but it does serve to pull people together. And the CEO would have been here tonight, and you know, he's great. He's very active, and he's like a go-to. There are forums, you know, chat groups and meetings and so on, and there's quite a big body of people working within the Gulf, and we're loosely aware of what one another's doing. It's quite hard to pull everyone together on one project, as I
would reflect that we are all three of us have worked together.
Yeah.
And Koha, sorry. So you said did the three girls, Sarah, yeah. I mean, most of us wear a few different hats in this space as well. So I think it is fragmented. It could be. It would be lovely to see sort of a more cohesive landscape scale restoration for the Hauraki Gulf. Just thinking about the Hauraki Gulf. But we don't have that at the moment, and we can't just sort of, you know, magic it up either. But I think what is really, really encouraging is the connectivity amongst restoration groups. So Kelsey, like science, we are. There's not a day where my phone doesn't sort of ping constantly. There's chat groups. There's there is a lot of connectivity. Yeah, I'm not across it all today. You know, so there's a lot of connectivity amongst us.
I understand that.
Yeah.
There's an overall coordinating body that's drawing it all together.
Yeah. And I certainly think credit to the Hauraki Gulf Forum, because for the last few years they have, so their legislative role is to convene and coordinate for the Gulf, and they have limitations by the way that their 20-year-old statute is currently written, but they have provided that coordination, particularly around advocacy in the last few years, which has been of I think real benefit to the Gulf, and is starting to take some strides there for us. So it's not perfect, but it's not as fragmented as perhaps it looks from the outside.
Okay, last thing, can I get a few takeaways that you would like the audience today to go home with, whether they are actionable points or if they are something to think about? Something from each of you.
I would firstly offer my thanks to you all for your participation. To come out on a very short night. There's not much sunlight anymore in these days, but to come out and give your evening to coalesce around this topic of oceans is heartwarming to me. So thank you for that, and don't underestimate the importance of participation. So thank you for your participation.
I like to, agree completely with Katina, but also if you've got friends who you know that could do better with fishing or extraction or land use, I think we have to kind of gently speak up. And if you don't make it, if they're not our enemies, they're just people who hold views that are different from ours, and there's always common ground to be found. So if you can identify the common ground and then gently go into those other areas, you may not think you get anywhere, but I know in our experience that often the benefits from those discussions can come back sometime later, and you won't know what they are at the time that you have them. So don't stop trying.
I would say two big things. One is that it's so important to keep in mind the huge potential for success.
Yeah.
It is definitely a good goal to aim for in all of it, and some types are going to be easier than others, but there's a lot of hope. And even though my work is very science focused, that's not where the change comes. The change comes from all of us coming together, all the different stakeholders coming to the table, iwi working with science, with fishermen, with community groups. It's going to have to come from all directions.
Sweet. Tēnā tātou katoa, ka nui te mihi ki a koutou mā mo tō tātou awhi ki te awhi me tō tātou manaaki, te akitanga ki te moana. Tēnā koutou. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you all so much for your love and your compassion and your protection of our marine spaces. And a massive shout out to the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO. That's a mouthful. I've been practicing all day. Thank you guys for sponsoring tonight's event. Can you please give it up one more time for our presenters today? Awesome. And that's it.